January 11th, 1944, 21,000 feet over Oschersleben, Germany. A formation of B-17 bombers is deep inside the Reich, headed for one of Germany's most heavily defended aircraft manufacturing plants. They are supposed to have fighter escorts. The escorts, most of them, are gone. Separated in cloud cover, low on fuel, pulled off to other engagements. 30 German fighters have found the bombers. Focke-Wulf 19s and Messerschmitt 109s. They are moving in to attack. One P-51 Mustang is between them and the bombers. One pilot, alone. For the next 30 minutes, Colonel James Howard does not break off. He does not call for help. He attacks. He was the only fighter pilot in the entire European theater of operations to receive the Medal of Honor for a single mission. The bomber crews who watched it happen said they had never seen anything like it, before or after. James Howell. Howard was born April 8, 1913, in Canton, China, the son of an ophthalmologist working as a medical missionary. He grew up between China and the United States, graduated from Pomona College in California, and earned his naval aviator wings in 1937. He resigned his Navy commission in 1941 to join the American Volunteer Group, the unit that would become famous as the Flying Tigers. He flew combat missions over Burma and China against the Japanese before the United States had formally entered the war. By the time he came home, he had already shot down confirmed enemy aircraft in a theater most Americans had barely heard of. He was not a young man learning to fly. He was a 30-year-old veteran combat pilot who had already been at war for 2 years when he joined the 354th Fighter Group in England in late 1943, one of the first units to fly the new P-51 Mustang in the European theater. The P-51 was a different aircraft from anything the Luftwaffe had planned for, and Howard was a different kind of pilot. What happened over Oschersleben on January 11th was not the act of a man who didn't know what he was flying into. He knew exactly. He went in anyway. The mission on January 11th was a deep penetration raid on the Focke-Wulf aircraft factory at Oschersleben, one of Germany's most important production facilities and one of its most heavily defended targets. The 8th Air Force sent nearly 300 bombers. The losses on this mission, across the full formation, would ultimately number 42 aircraft and over 400 men. Howard's 354th Fighter Group was assigned to escort one of the bomber boxes, a tight formation of B-17s deep inside German airspace. As the formation pushed toward the target, cloud cover and combat separated the American fighters. Most of the escort was gone. The Luftwaffe found the bombers. 30 fighters, Focke-Wulf 19s and Messerschmitt 109s, moved in on the formation. Howard spotted them and moved to intercept. What followed lasted approximately 30 minutes. He made pass after pass into the German formation, breaking up attack runs before they reached the bombers, forcing Luftwaffe pilots to deal with him instead of the B-17s. His ammunition ran low. At points, he was making dry firing passes, charging the Germans with an empty gun to break up their approach angles. The Medal of Honor citation credits him with destroying at least 3 enemy aircraft. Bomber crew accounts, filed separately and after action reports, suggest the number may have been higher. He also probably damaged several others. When it was over, the German fighters had withdrawn. What the bomber crews filed in their debriefing statements, what they said about what they had just watched, is as close to a first-hand account of something almost unbelievable as the record holds. January 11th, 1944, was one of the bloodiest days in 8th Air Force history. The full mission, not just Howard's engagement, but the entire Oschersleben raid, cost 42 bombers and more than 400 American airmen. The mission was nearly called off due to weather and was pressed forward, despite conditions that made the planned fighter-escort coordination nearly impossible to execute. The escort that Howard's group was supposed to be part of, the full fighter screen that should have surrounded those bombers, fell apart before the target. Cloud cover, fuel limitations, and the sheer distance of the penetration into Germany were factors the planning had not fully solved. The strategic bombing campaign of 1944 was built on an assumption that bomber formations, tightly grouped with interlocking defensive fire, could survive without close fighter escort all the way to the target. That assumption had been killing American airmen since 1943. The disastrous Schweinfurt raids, Black Thursday, October 14, 1943, had cost 77 bombers and over 600 men in a single day. Oschersleben was a continuation of a strategy that High Command knew was broken and had not yet fixed. The long-range escort capability that the P-51 represented was the solution, but it had not yet been fully deployed in the numbers needed. The men in those B-17 over Oschersleben on January 11th were paying the price for a planning failure that their commanders were still in the process of correcting. Howard knew what those men were flying into. He also knew, when the rest of the escort peeled away, that there was no one else. James Howard received the Medal of Honor from General Dwight D. Eisenhower later in 1944. He was the only fighter pilot in the European theater to receive the decoration for a single mission. Every other fighter pilot Medal of Honor in the European War was awarded posthumously, or for actions across multiple engagements. The bomber crews who had watched the fight from their gun positions and cockpit windows had filed their debriefing statements the evening of January 11th. One navigator, asked to describe what he had seen, reportedly said he didn't know who the P-51 pilot was, but it was the greatest exhibition of flying he had ever witnessed. Howard was characteristically understated about the engagement. In his own account, he said he saw the bombers needed help, and he provided it. He expressed regret that his ammunition had run out before he could do more. He had grown up partly in China. He had flown combat in Burma. He had watched the Flying Tigers fight a war that the United States government officially wasn't part of yet. He was not a man who thought of himself as performing something exceptional. What the historical record shows, and what rarely gets attention in the accounts that do mention Oschersleben, is the broader context of what the P-51 represented at that moment in the air war. Howard's 354th Fighter Group was among the first to fly it in the European theater. The aircraft's range, far beyond any previous American fighter, was the technical answer to the escort problem that had been killing bomber crews since 1943. Howard's 30 minutes over Oschersleben was, in one sense, the first real proof of what was now possible. Within months, P-51s were flying all the way to Berlin and back. The bomber losses that had defined 1943 dropped sharply. The air war changed. Howard survived the war, came home, and lived a long life. The part of his story that tends to get left out is what he said, quietly in interviews decades later, about the men he couldn't save. 42 bombers went down on January 11th, 1944. Not in Howard's formation. The group he protected came home intact. But across the full Oschersleben mission, more than 400 American airmen were killed, wounded, or captured that day. Howard protected the men he could reach, the ones beyond his reach, in other formations, in other parts of the sky, went down without an escort that should have been there. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany cost the United States Army Air Forces more than 26,000 men killed in the European theater. It was, by any measure, one of the most costly air campaigns in the history of warfare, and it was built, for a significant portion of its duration, on a tactical doctrine that the commanders running it knew was producing unsustainable losses. Howard received his medal. He came home. He lived until 1995, 82 years old. In later interviews, He spoke about Oschersleben without bravado. He spoke about the bomber crews. He spoke about the ones who didn't make it back that day. He never called what he did extraordinary. He called it his job. The men in those B-17 called it something else entirely. James Howard grew up between two countries. He flew combat before his country was officially at war. He came to England in 1943 with a new aircraft in a war that was going badly for the men flying the bombers. On January 11, 1944, when the escort broke apart and 30 German fighters moved in, he did not calculate the odds. He was a fighter pilot. There were bombers that needed covering. He covered them. For 30 minutes alone, he held that sky. He was asked years later whether he had been afraid over Oschersleben. He said he had been too busy to be afraid. The bomber crews who watched from their gun positions were not too busy. They knew exactly what they were seeing. One pilot, alone, deciding that the men in those aircraft were worth whatever it cost. He was right.